The Eagle Lake Mounds site. This paper was prepared for the Arkansas Archaeological Society annual meeting of September 2021. Glenn Akridge is presenting this script prepared by Marvin Jeter. As an octogenarian time traveler from the mid-20th century, Marvin couldn't figure out how to record and send the audio version to go with the PowerPoint slides. He thanks his colleagues, Bob Scott and Don Bragg, who provided a lot of images for the slides and other information. This is dedicated to the memory of our late great colleague and friend, Frank Schambach. Some of his work was very relevant here. He defined the Felsenthal region of the lower Mississippi Valley culture area and its cultural sequence. He also introduced the descriptive classification system that Bob used for the ceramics. Here's Frank's map showing the Felsenthal region in south central to southeast Arkansas, down into Louisiana, halfway to Monroe. Our site is near the middle of the region, just above the juncture of the Saline and Ouachita rivers. Below that is the lowest land and water in Arkansas, only about 60 feet above sea level. That's much lower than the Mississippi when it leaves the state. This is from Tom Henning's report on his remarkable amphibious bankline survey, restricted to lands below 65 feet elevation, along the Ouachita and lower Saline rivers. The lowlands were naturally flooded for about half of the year, especially from late winter through early spring, so sites down there were necessarily seasonal. A number of habitation sites and mound centers like Eagle Lake were high and dry on the surrounding old high terrace edges or small terrace remnants, locally called pine islands. Based on nearly 1,700 witness trees recorded by 19th century GLO surveyors, Don produced these graphics showing that the site is an ecotonal location bordering upland pine hardwood and bottomland hardwood forest, with isolated ridges and pine islands in between. Acorn producing oaks of the red and white groups were common, hickories much less so. As for faunal resources, this is now a national wildlife refuge. A major breakthrough in Felsenthal archaeology was this report on the Shallow Lake site in Union County by Martha Rollingston and Schambach. In it, Frank defined the regional cultural sequence and set up the classification system for the late prehistoric decorated grog-tempered pottery. This involved 5 kinds of decorations: Class A, with slanting and sized lines; Class B, mostly horizontal lines; Class C, punctated or pinched; Class D, brushed; and Class E, engraved. All Class A designs have names that begin with A, both for rims like these and for body designs like these. Or names begin with C for all punctated designs, here on bodies. But there's something unusual about the late grog-tempered decorated pottery in this region. Very often, pots were decorated by one technique on the rim and another on the body. This combination of Class A incising on the rim and Class C punctation on the body was especially common. Frank remarked that this poses problems for the lower valley's type variety system, which is based on only one decoration technique. Here's an oversimplified version of Frank's regional sequence, with the earliest cultures at the bottom and going up through later ones. We do have one Dalton item from Eagle Lake and some archaic and woodland stuff. But here we'll emphasize the parts in boldface type, as the mounds and middens date mainly to them. Decorated grog-tempered pottery appeared around the late Coles Creek period, after about 1000 AD, and became more popular during Plaquemine times, between about 1200 and 1450. Also, two distinctive arrow point types, Holman and then Ashley, were used, along with other types. Defined strictly, Holman points have fan-shaped stems expanding toward a convex base, with corners where stem sides meet the base. Ashley points ideally have a rounded bulbous stem, curving continuously with the base. But these were not precision-made, and all sorts of in-betweens occur. They also appear to overlap in time. Holman's may date between about the 800s and 1100s. Ashley's from around 1000 to the 1300s. The terminal prehistoric Mississippi period is not well represented at Eagle Lake, nor is late cattle culture from the west. So far, we found almost no shell-tempered or engraved pottery. Before the survey was founded, sites were reported to the University of Arkansas Museum in Fayetteville. This 1965 sketch, the first known map of the site, was apparently made from memory after a brief visit. Its north arrow is wrong. It only very roughly indicated the four mounds' locations and got their shapes and sizes confused. After the survey's UAM station was founded, Martha Rollingson and Robert Taylor visited the site. Here's Robert's 1970 sketch. It notes a depression in the middle of the plaza. Martha later assigned the letters to the mounds, starting with A for the largest one and proceeding clockwise with B, C, and D. Here's a sketch made by John House after a 1985 visit. He also noted the uncultivated, grassy low area. More about it later. West and east of it were two plowed fields. He made surface collections from them in three places where artifacts appeared fairly abundant. Number one was just east of Big Mound A, and is the only collection made there so far. A second was made on both sides of Little Mound D, mostly southeastward toward Mound C. We later collected there too. His third collection was in the eastern plowed fields corner. We later collected there more extensively. John also noted abundant lithics, possibly archaic, just north of Mound C, but didn't have time to collect there. Alas, we didn't either. Some items John collected include an archaic point or knife and a Dalton reworked into a drill. On top are arrow points, including two that are Ashley-like. In the 1990s, Jeter worked intermittently at the site with many society members, especially three great ones from nearby who are now deceased, Armand Dressel from Camden, and Ed and Patsy White from Hamburg, plus lots of others, including UAM students and visiting archaeologists, soil scientists, etc. Staffers from the Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge helped with two highly successful open house events, one of which brought 128 people to this remote site. That's public archaeology. Jeter set up a temporary grid with transit and tape and used it to make more tightly controlled surface collections from the plowed fields. He set up 28 20 by 20 meter squares, 12 in a southwest midden locus, west and east of Mound D, and 16 units in a northeast midden locus. He also transit mapped the small Mound D. More on that later, but didn't have time and personnel to map the whole huge site and its vicinity. That had to wait for 21st century technology. Namely LIDAR. Don Bragg downloaded and edited this contour map, shaded darker going down to the creek in the northwest corner. The ancient terrace remnant's upper portion, more than 24 meters or about 80 feet above sea level, is a high and dry island during the annual floods. For his next trick, Don shaded all elevations above 28.5 meters, which clearly isolated all four of the mounds like this. Finally, Don shaded all elevations above 27.5 meters. All four mounds and most of the surface artifact concentrations were on this relatively high ground. We don't know whether that low area between the mounds was always low. Or was it once above this present elevation, and maybe the Indians borrowed topsoil from it for some of their mound building field dirt. Now some results from controlled surface collections. Here's the northeast locus contours for sherd counts. There are two separate dense zones, north and south, about 40 meters apart, maybe the remnants of two households. Sherds included classes A, B, and C. And for lithic density, a somewhat similar pattern, but without a real southern concentration. Lithics included a big late archaic dart point made of novaculite, and several arrow points, some Holman-like or Ashley-like. Here's the southwest locus, west and east of Mound D. This shows separate concentrations of sherds, densest in the far east. Again, classes A, B, and C were present. For lithics, again, two separate concentrations, one more definitely around Mound D, but the main concentration is to the west. More Holman and Ashley point examples, and some in between. Also, previously, some archaic points and the Dalton drill had come from here. The LIDAR contours suggest that Mound C may have had a ramp, which we hadn't noticed due to heavy vegetation. But we had noticed what we called a moundlet, a low but definite elevation atop the northwest quarter of the mound. Lacking time to tackle the big mound, we tested the moundlet with a little trench, as shown on the next slide. This schematic view of the mound top shows that we got lucky. Our 1 by 6 meter trench caught the transition between the moundlet stage 1, dark brown loam with a few artifacts, and stage 2, yellowish, hard, and clayey, virtually sterile. This was verified by a dozen soil cores outside of the trench. This sketch gives a schematic profile of the strata. First, the main mound, then stage 1 of the moundlet, then stage 2. We found only a few plain sherds and a couple of arrow points, one Ashley-like from moundlet field brought in from earlier deposits nearby. The next year, on to Little Mound D, which Jeter had transit mapped earlier, now surfer contoured by Bob. Again, a little 1 by 6 meter trench, hoping to catch the west edge of the mound, but we didn't quite get there. Here at the west end of the trench, we still had some mound loading, over a sub-mound midden and ancient terrace soil horizons. As usual, a mixture of artifacts from brought-in mound field, a couple of archaic points, and several arrow points, again including Holman and Ashley suspects. The one at lower right is of special interest. Jeter found it at the very bottom of the deep east end of the trench, from sub-mound midden with well over a meter of mound field above that. It resembles the Alba type, found in Louisiana, mostly in Coles Creek context. So Mound D is at least that late. In summary, we don't have radiocarbon dates yet, but we know a little bit about the Mound C moundlet, the Little Mound D, and the non-mound midden loci, which all date mainly to the late Coles Creek and especially Plaquemine culture periods. But we know almost nothing about the huge Mound A, nor Mound B, except their late appearing shapes. Eagle Lake has incredibly well-preserved mounds, plus middens, and is well protected. But we have only scratched below the surface. Maybe some fine day, somebody will have a productive summer dig there. Thank you very much.